Do you need help protecting your finances as you enter retirement? David Dickens of KC Financial Advisors has got you covered. Welcome to the Cover Your Assets KC podcast.
Hey there, it's another edition of Cover Your Assets KC. I'm Walter Storholt alongside David Dickens, the President and Wealth Advisor at KC Financial Advisors. We're online at coveryourassetskc.com. And on today's show, we're talking about 5 things to know about QCDs, Qualified Charitable Distributions. Can't wait for the conversation today. Love it when we're able to box things into a nice little package with a bow on it, like 5 things to know. It's just very easy to remember, David, so I appreciate that and hope you're doing well.
I am doing well, and I'm excited about this this topic today. It's one of the things that occasionally Congress puts some nice little goodies into a tax bill that actually benefit people who have done pretty well for themselves. A lot of times it disadvantages those kind of folks. So today's, if you've done well for yourself, you got a big, fat, juicy IRA or 401k, this is a topic you'll absolutely positively want to know about. And we'll talk about a few opportunities and maybe a pitfall or two.
Fantastic. I can't wait. And so let's get right to it and not waste any time today. So what is the first thing that we just need to know about QCDs?
Well, so maybe before I get to number one, let me just real quickly backfill and say, well, what is a QCD? So a qualified charitable distribution, that came about because a couple of years ago, Congress significantly increased the amount of your standard deduction on your tax return, such that their goal was to eliminate maybe so that 90 or 95% of taxpayers did not have to do itemized returns anymore, and especially retired people. But if you're not doing an itemized return anymore, then your charitable contributions, well, so for instance, if you're married filing joint this year and you're over 65, your standard deduction is a little bit greater than 27 grand. Well, it's very unlikely that your itemized deductions, your Schedule A, is going to add up to $27,650. If you're single, that's $14,350 this year. And so any charitable gifts that you made to your church, your school, any other 501c3, those would not be deductible for you. But what this does is to say, all right, I am now over 70 and a half. Well, that's actually number one. So in order to use a qualified charitable distribution, you have to be over 70 and a half years old. And what you're doing is gifting money directly from the custodian. That's Fidelity or TD Ameritrade or Schwab, directly from the custodian. Your IRA is having money going directly from the custodian to your church, to your university, to a 501c3, a tax-exempt entity that you want to gift money to. And in that case, you don't actually write it off of your taxes, but the IRS never sees that distribution. They see it, but they don't get to count it as income to you. Whereas if you take the money from TD Ameritrade and then write a check to that church or your university, well, that is a totally taxable transaction. So QCD is a way to give money and still get the tax benefit even if you're not itemizing. And the number one thing to know about it is you have to be at least 70 and a half years old to qualify for a QCD.
Certainly. So this is going to be something for people who have already retired, gotten into that phase of life for a little while, most likely, and now looking for, kind of what to do on the tail end with some of these excess funds. So this is fantastic because I know a lot of people that you work with, David, will be in that zone and interested in this concept of QCDs and how they can benefit.
This is
people.
Super common.
Yeah. Super
common for people that have, they've saved well for themselves. It is kind of interesting, Walter. So people say, well, wait a minute, why 70 and a half? Well, because this was created when required distributions started at 70 and a half.
And people didn't need that extra money all the time, right?
So most everybody knows required distributions now start at 72. But the requirement for doing a QCD did not change from 70 and a half. So nice little extra benefit there. You don't have to wait until required minimum distributions start to do a QCD.
Okay. Well, what is the second thing we should know about QCDs?
Well, the second thing is, and it's a fairly big number for most people, but the most you can give this way in any given year out of your 401k or your IRA, actually out of your IRA, I should say, is $100,000 per person. So if you're married filing jointly, well, each of you and your spouse could do $100,000, so a total of $200,000. If you're single, you could do $20,000 to 5 different entities, or $100,000 to your church. But either way, that's the most you can do in any given year.
Okay, so we got some limits here and there. That's good to know about. What about the third thing to know about QCDs?
So the third one is actually something that I just corrected myself on as I was speaking. You can't do a QCD from a 401k. It has to be from an IRA rollover. So what most people do when they retire is they have they maybe have an IRA rollover that they've been rolling old 401k plans into. And then they have usually a nice big juicy 401k from their last employer. And if you're going to do a QCD, you need to roll that money into your IRA rollover. And from that bucket of money, you can do these QCDs all day long as you're over 70 and a half, up to $100,000 per person.
Okay, very good. That's good to know, David. We're moving through these quickly. I love it. Fourth thing to know about QCDs. I'm a man of very
few words, Walter. So
you just
no
straight to the point
here.
today. That's great. How about the fourth thing to know?
So this is super important, but the money has to go from the custodian directly to the charity, the church, the university, etc. And it cannot go to, let's say, a donor-advised fund that you have set up previously, or it can't go to some private grant-making foundation. It has to go directly to the institution that you're benefiting. So I have clients that made maybe they had a business sale or something, and for charitable and tax reasons, they set up a donor-advised fund. You can't gift money out of your IRA and put it into your donor-advised fund. It has to actually go to the church or to your university, for instance, and it has to go directly from that custodian, TD Ameritrade, Fidelity, Schwab, directly what they normally do is send a check that would say, made out to the charity, and it'll have, for instance, my name on it, so that the charity knows who to credit when they get this big wad of money. But that's how it works, but it has to go directly to the charity.
Helpful. So it's kind of like when you're doing an IRA rollover or something. You want to make sure that you don't let that money sit outside of an account for too long, or else you'll be paying taxes and penalties and those kinds of things. You got to make sure you do all the timing and the direction of where to send that check and all of that appropriate. Kind of some legalese type items or some formulas of how to make all this work properly on the back end here.
Exactly. So for a 60-day rollover, you can let the money sit in your bank account for 59 days. But with a qualified charitable distribution, you can't let it sit anywhere for even 2 seconds. It has to go direct. If it touches your hands, your bank account, etc., gets disqualified.
No good. So we want to make sure we do these properly. No mistakes allowed on this one. All right, what's the fifth thing to know about QCDs?
So the fifth thing is, so we're right in the middle of tax season with our clients. We do probably 200 or 250 tax returns this year. And I've had a couple of clients that give me their list of charitable deductions because they still do itemize. And they listed that amount of money. Also, they added that to the other charitable donations that they had made. So what you have to understand is you don't get your cake and eat it too.
Oh.
With a qualified charitable distribution, the IRS doesn't count that as income, so you can't also take it as a deduction. So it's, one or the other. If you're already itemizing, then maybe you don't mess around with the QCD. But if you're not itemizing, you absolutely want to do a QCD. And again, if you're itemizing, don't include it as in your list of contributions, or at some point that will come back to you and you'll end up in future years filing an amendment on this year's tax return and owing a bunch of tax money on that distribution.
I just had to amend last year's return, David, but luckily it was the other direction. I'll be getting a little extra back from the amendment. So.
That's the best kind of amended tax return.
I was just about to say, yes. I would have had very little motivation to do it otherwise.
Hey, Walter, one freebie. I know we said 5, but there's actually kind of an add-on here. I've seen IRA accounts that have check writing privileges. That's just the way that the client set it up at TD Ameritrade or Fidelity or et cetera. And what you want to make sure that you do is on these QCDs, you don't want to wait till mid-December to have either to come in to see me or your advisor and say, hey, I forgot, I need to do these QCDs right away. What you can run into or write a check yourself from your IRA directly to the church. That'll work as long as they cash the check and record it as a 2022 contribution. But if they cash the check in 2023 and record it in their books as a 23 contribution, then your QCD doesn't count for this year. So not only is it won't be a taxable transaction because the government will think you didn't take an RMD this year. So it gets very twisty, a lot of things to unwind if you wait till the end of the year to do this. So, the latest you'd really want to be doing this is kind of around September 1st or October 1st. Don't get in November, December and think I'm going to jam through a QCD at the last minute. It might work out, but it also might cause you a lot of headache and heartache in the next couple of years as you're filing amended returns.
I've got one more other little bonus question for you, David, and I feel like you kind of covered it a little bit, but I just want to clarify perhaps. Is anybody doing a QCD who's not worried about that RMD component? I mean, is this really just a solution for folks who have the RMD problem, or does a QCD make sense even if the RMD issue isn't involved?
So someone who's done super well for themselves and they're just trying to burn off income. Well, they're charitable, and a lot of their money sits in an IRA or an old 401k that they rolled over into an IRA. It's a really nice way to up to $100,000, because somebody's RMD is in most cases unlikely to be greater than $100,000 per person in the couple. And it could be, but at age 70 and a half or 72 or 75, it's relatively unlikely. And so it's a really good way to be charitable with the money you've set aside for retirement. And maybe you still take you may still take money out. You probably wouldn't because you're satisfying the requirement. You're just burning off money that is at some point going to be taxable. And I mean, who knows, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, they could reverse and not allow QCDs anymore. So it's a really good way for people to gift this type of money while they're living to charities they care about and not have the IRS get to take a bite out of it.
Fantastic. I think that's a great clarification, David, and shows you the flexibility of that program. So if QCDs are something you're interested in taking advantage of, or you can see how that might be helpful for your financial situation, you definitely want to do it correctly, do it right, because RMDs are, often a big part of the component and a component in the equation. You want to make sure that you're following all the rules appropriately. And David and his team, it's common. They help walk people through this all the time. So give them a call if you've got any questions about this at all. 913-317-1414 is the number. Or go online to coveryourassetskc.com. Not only can you get in touch with David there, but you can also find other great resources, past episodes of the show, blog posts, lots of other great things there as well. Coveryourassetskc.com. And as always, we'll link to it in the description of today's show. Well, David, thank you so much for all of the help and guidance on the program today and for breaking down these QCDs for us. Looking forward to chatting with you again next week.
I will look forward as well. I have absolutely no idea what we're going to talk about, but we'll come up with something.
We always come up with something good. So.
Something compelling.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, David. We appreciate it. For David Dickens, I'm Walter Storholt. We will talk to you next time right back here on the Cover Your Assets KC podcast.
Investment advisory services offered through ChangePath LLC, a registered investment advisor. ChangePath LLC and KC Financial Advisors are separate companies.